Anne Longfield, the Children's Commissioner, has said quite clearly, if we have to shut shops and we have to shut pubs again to allow schools to reopen, that's a trade-off we should make. Do you agree?
Well, I think they're both right. The government is right to say schools are the priority. Absolutely. And I would fully sign up to that. And if something else has to give, well, it's things that are lower down the priority list. And Anne Longfield is also right. She's given a couple there that would have to take lower priority than schools. So this is going to be a really difficult situation. But it does go back to what I was saying before. Get this test and trace system working, and maybe you wouldn't have to make these kind of choices. It's just daft to be going into the second half of this year without that system working properly, because then you will be back in the territory of blanket restrictions of the kind that we're having to put up with in Greater Manchester right now. The test and trace system is meant to avoid that, but as we know, it isn't working. Get that system working. The head of test and trace last week, Dido Harding, said that they had to correct this problem of a lack of financial support for the lowest paid in society. And I hope if the government won't listen to me, we'll at least listen to her. She's your own head of the test and trace system.
Yeah, indeed. Can I ask you, Fanny, you said it's daft that we haven't got it working. It's also, let's face it, it's a national outrage that we haven't got test and trace system working perfectly. Now, we know that a lot of the systems that we've been looking at abroad, say, Germany had one, South Korea, actually a lot of it isn't a super duper app. It is just human beings, as you say, getting on the phone, knocking on doors, tracking people down. And even if we did manage to actually, persuade people or pay for people to be at home and self-isolate, the issue seems to be actually getting in touch with these people in the first place. Is there really any excuse this many months into a pandemic when so many billions have been spent on the healthcare, on the furlough scheme and others, but is there any excuse whatsoever for the government not to have a fully working, totally, not perfect, nothing's ever going to be perfect, but a fully working, substantial test, track and trace system to enable us to undoubtedly avoid a second lockdown?
Nope, there's no excuse.
There isn't, is there? This is the bit I don't get.
Fully functional. And let me tell you what we've said to them all the way through this. Go the local route. Because people here have done it for years. There are kind of sexually transmitted infections, TB, HIV. There's teams on the ground in all communities in the country are used to contact tracing for conditions that we know about, other conditions. So they know what they're doing, but they weren't used and they were bypassed. And the government went straight to set up this national call centre operation. Now, Julia, we are where we are. As I said before, that national system can reach a certain proportion of people who are easier to reach, let's put it that way, for one reason and another. The other bit has to be done by local authorities. And that means giving them resources, money, to employ people to do the old-fashioned contact tracing. So this is how you make this thing work from here. The government have allocated £10 billion to this, and it isn't working. They need to give some of that money to councils to employ people to do door-to-door contact tracing. But crucially, it needs to be backed up by that point I made about people being able to self-isolate without fear of not being paid or losing their job on that jury service principle. Put those things in place, we'll be ready to face the winter. If you don't do it, I think we're going to face some really difficult times ahead. Okay,
Andy Burnham, Mayor of Greater Manchester, thank you as always for joining us. You're announcing today huge sums of money for building projects for new academies, sixth form colleges, voluntary aided schools, transforming facilities, improving school buildings. But it's not much use if we haven't got the kids back in those school buildings, is it?
No, we want all children to be back in school in September, but we want school buildings to be of the highest quality. So this is 580 projects that we're announcing today on top of the 1,400 we've already announced this year to make sure that teachers and pupils are in good quality school buildings where they can get the best education possible. It's also about kickstarting the economy. These are projects that are ready to go, ready to employ contractors, ready to provide work and jobs, ready to kickstart the economy. So this is an important announcement that we're making, and it's been swiftly delivered. The Prime Minister announced this money, £560 million on the 29th of June, and here we are just over a month later announcing 580 detailed projects about how that money is going to be spent in our school system. But you are right, Julia, we want all children back in school in September, and schools are working hard to make sure that their premises are safe, that there's hygiene and hand washing, children are in those bubbles to make sure they're not mixing with too many other children unnecessarily, staggered playtimes, staggered lunchtimes, and so on, to make sure that we minimise the risk of any spread of the virus in the school.
Okay, and do all schools, do they actually know what they need to do? Because there seem to be a lot of big question marks. So we spoke to an academy chain boss yesterday who said they're planning for various different scenarios. Now, his attitude was very much a can-do. We're going to plan for all the different scenarios depending on where we are with the virus and the outbreaks, and we're going to be able to adapt. Some organisations not being quite so adaptable. Some of the teaching unions, not all of the teaching unions, it has to be said, but some of them seem to constantly want to put roadblocks in place, trying to stop schools from opening. It's always never going to be safe enough. It's always going to be too big a problem. Is the government prepared to stand up to those teaching unions and say, if your teachers don't go back in September, then they're out of a job?
Well, we work quite closely with the unions in terms of, there's very detailed guidance that we're providing to schools. We've worked on that with Public Health England and the Chief Medical Officer, and we work with the unions. We consult them very frequently, regularly, about all these issues to make sure that they're fully informed about what we're doing. And as you say, some unions are better than others in terms of their public reaction to what we're trying to do. But I think all parents and I think the public now want children back in school. It's good for their mental well-being to be with their friends, and it's really important for their long-term education that they're back in school with their teachers, catching up on any education they might have missed while the schools have been closed to most pupils.
Well, indeed. I mean, again, we know, and I've discussed this many times, that actually it's the most disadvantaged pupils who've lost out the most during this. Is there going to be a proper inquiry, not just in terms of what's happened with handling the coronavirus, but in terms of what's happened with schooling? Because we know 2 million children didn't have pretty much any education whatsoever. Another couple of million plus just got a worksheet at the beginning of the week on a Monday. Other schools were able to provide full on lessons online all day, every day, and do everything to make sure their pupils didn't miss out any more than absolutely necessary. Have we really ensured we've done enough? And are we going to actually have a full inquiry to find out which schools delivered and which didn't? And actually, penalties to be paid, because these children won't get these months back.
Well, two things really. First of all, schools are all accountable for the results of the school, so it will be clear in the year ahead about which schools have been the most effective in providing work and study for children while at home. And schools have done a great job, by and large, in providing that work at home.
4.5 million kids haven't had a proper education, and you think schools have done a great job? Wow,
well,
you've got low standards.
You see these reports in the newspapers, but I know
No, I don't see these reports in the newspapers. I hear from people. I've got friends of mine, and they haven't even got the excuse that they're in the sink estate and no one's got an iPad or broadband. I'm talking about middle class parents sending their kids to a school who've not heard a single thing from the school for months on end.
And there are cases where that has happened. There are schools that are less that perform less well. And what we've been doing over the last 10 years is tackling underperforming schools right across the system. And there are now fewer of those schools than there were back in 2010. But having said all that, we want children to catch up. And that's why the Prime Minister announced a £1 billion package for schools to help any child, all children, that have lost out while the schools have been closed to most pupils. And that's about one-to-one tuition. It's about extra support in the school.
But they wouldn't need that. They wouldn't need it if teachers had done their job. Look, I'm sure the vast majority of teachers have done a great job and have done their very, very best in very difficult circumstances, as most people have. The teachers who haven't, the head teachers who just went, frankly, don't need to do it. Those members of teaching unions who've gone, it's not our job to teach kids at home. We can't go in the classroom. Not our job. Should those people still be employed, paid for by the taxpayers, paid for by the parents whose kids go to their schools, if they're not actually willing to do the job of teaching our children?
Well, everything we've done since 2010 is about pushing up standards in our schools, and we have been successful in doing that. But there's always more to do, and we are vigilant and energetic in terms of pushing school reform further. Schools are held accountable by the inspector at Ofsted, and those inspections will start again in January, but there'll be Ofsted visits to schools even in this autumn term approaching. The results of schools are published in performance tables, so they are held to account for the results of the school. But we do know that even with the best home education provided by schools, that is never as good as a child being in the classroom. So most children will have lost some education as a consequence of this crisis. So we do want them to catch up. It is our absolute objective that no child will suffer detriment as a consequence of the coronavirus to their long-term education and life chances. And that's what the Catch-Up Fund is all about. And we are really focused in particular on children taking their GCSEs next year and their A-levels next year.
Okay. I just still find it extraordinary that if a teacher refuses, without a good health reason, not to go in the classroom in September, you're not saying they should be sacked. Need a little bit of a dose of Charlie Mullins from Pimlico Plumbers, don't you?
Well, the head teachers are responsible for, for their teachers.
You and me are paying their wages. They're public servants. If they're not willing to do their job, why should they be in a job?
Well, this is a slightly jaundiced view of the teaching profession. I meet teachers all the time and have.
I've got good family friends who are teachers.
And they're good people and they work hard.
Yeah, and they're just as horrified as I am by the teachers who've not been doing their job.
But what you're talking about is you get the minority in every profession, every work.
4.3 million children haven't had an education during lockdown worth speaking of, and you're saying it's a tiny minority. Really?
Well, it's a tiny minority.
Really? 4.3 million children haven't had an education.
Well,
I don't know, unless you think a worksheet once a week's an education. I don't know. Maybe you think that's good enough, Nick. I've known you for many years. I don't think you do think that's good enough.
No, I don't think that's good enough. These were challenging circumstances for school. There's no question about that. But I know of wonderful work done by the vast majority of teachers who really have gone the extra mile for their pupils. And we don't want to tarnish the whole profession.
We're not.
With the shortcomings of a minority.
We're not.
And there are a minority in every walk of life who don't pull their weight. But we are determined. And standards have been rising in our schools. Behaviour's been improving in our schools. We're rising in international league tables as a consequence of our reforms. We're determined that when schools go back in September, that we will ensure children catch up any education that they've lost out, and that we will resume our reform programme to ensure that we continue to tackle those schools that are still underperforming. We want every local school to be a school that parents can be proud and assured of sending their children to.
Well, I would agree with you on that. I wish you the best of luck and our young people the best of luck. Thank you very much indeed, Schools Minister Nick Gibb. For England, Anne Longfield has said that, well, if there happen to be trade-offs that have to be made to get schools open, then so be it. If that means closing pubs again, if that means closing non-essential shops, then let's do that to get kids back in the classroom. Well, let's talk to the Children's Commissioner about that right now. Good morning to you, Anne Longfield.
Good morning.
Thank you very much indeed for joining us. I think you're echoing what an awful lot of parents are saying. We're trying to get people back to some semblance of normal life in a safe way, a COVID-safe way. But an awful lot of parents simply can't get back to work while their kids are still off school. And everyone really frantic with worry that children are missing out on, 6 months of education so far.
Well, that's right. I mean, the virus isn't going to go away. We have to manage it. We have to adapt. And schools reopening in September is a big step in that direction. Now, I've been really pleased that government has made a commitment to that. They say, full-time education from September, whatever it takes. And there's cross-party support for that. But what I'm really concerned about as well, obviously I need to see that through and we need the kind of track and tracing around it. But what I'm really concerned about, what happens if there's future lockdowns, be they local or national. And I want us to learn from what's happened in the first 6 months and actually make schools a priority. So they're the last doors to close and the first doors to open if decisions need to be made.
And this is the thing, isn't it, is that we saw schools close. Actually, we know against what the government had wanted to do. An awful lot of schools had to close back at the beginning of this pandemic, simply because parents wouldn't send their children into school. But the evidence is really very clear now from around the world that actually schools are one of the safest places for young people to be. No examples of teachers being infected by pupils. And when you see any infection, people can be locked down in bubbles and the like. The concern then comes down to, really, if we're getting rational as opposed to just people fearful of leaving their homes at all, which according to some teaching unions seems to be the case, we're down to the test, track and trace system. And there are a lot of concerns that we haven't got it up to speed enough that we can make sure that everyone is safe in our schools. Should that be the number one priority for getting schools reopening right now?
Well, for government, that has to be a huge priority, and it has to get better. And there's 5 weeks to do so. There's also a job to be done, of course, to reassure parents and children that schools are safe. Teachers have been working tirelessly to get the school set up in a way that can manage infection outbreaks and keep the environment healthy. But that track and trace system is absolutely vital, and that needs to be as absolutely top priority to get those schools open. But they must open. That has to be the case. It has to be can do, and it has to open. And we now need to prepare for any future scenario.
Well, that's it. I mean, again, it's simple stats. You're more likely to be hit by a car on the way to school than you are to get coronavirus and die of it in school, but more likely to be hit by lightning whilst in a car on the way to school than to catch coronavirus and die of it. And apart from for the obviously more elderly or more physically vulnerable teachers who understandably won't be able to go back in the classroom. But let's talk about what we do know, and that is how damaging it is for children not to be in school. Your responsibility as the Children's Commissioner for England is about the sort of long-term mental and physical needs of children. Tell us about some of the absolutely factually known costs of children not being at school.
Well, they've been out of school in what has been one of the biggest disruptions in schooling since World War II. By September, for most children, about 8 million children, that will be 6 months. Most children have been having some form of home learning, but many have struggled with that. Up to 2 million haven't been learning at home, and about 1 million haven't had the tech to get online. So that's 6 months without any of that interaction really with education. We know as well that it's been the most disadvantaged kids that will be put further behind during this period. And of course, children's mental health and well-being is one which, without their interaction with peers and without the structure of school, has plummeted for many children. So this is something which isn't a nice to have. It's absolutely essential, not only for kids to get back on their feet, and they haven't been the number one priority during the first 6 months. Part of my argument is they should be going forward. Get those kids back on their feet, get them catching up in their learning, but also give them that help and support to deal with what has been a huge shock for everyone. But for children making sense of it, it's something which is an absolutely enormous thing in their lives.
I have a funny feeling, and again, maybe that's also my daughter's been very lucky. She's had Zoom lessons throughout. We've been busy working, getting on with it, and she's a largely happy kid anyway. But it seems to me, it's a few miserable days. We're missing friends and missing school life, and playing netball and things like that. But largely being able to look at it as, look, we're very lucky. We've got a happy family. We're all safe and healthy, and we've got a roof over our heads. This will pass. This will be a long distance memory and something we'll talk about and joke about in the future. But that's not the reality, is it, for a lot of children for whom school, and I've got members of my own family for whom this was the case for them, school was their escape from very, very difficult home life, and school is a lifeline for those children, and their education is a lifeline to a better normal life in the future.
That's right. So there'll be really different experiences of that. If this has been about having more time with parents, which is something that often children crave in this busy world, then it's been a great time, especially if there's you've got plenty of room and outside space. But for those kids that are stuck in a very overcramped flat, for those that actually maybe are homeless and sofa surfing with their parents, for those that have got really fragile environments, we've seen domestic violence rising during this period. There'll be many children who were vulnerable going into the pandemic that are much, much more vulnerable now. For them, this has been a period which has been a disaster in their childhood, and getting them back into school will mean that they not only have the structure of school and that lifeline, but also those trusted adults there who can see when things are going wrong. Because what we've seen is referrals to social services and those that can help plummet during this crisis. So they aren't getting the help because they aren't being picked up. So this will be very different. They'll need help to get back into school. They'll need mental health support and pastoral care in school. But also we know there's a recession on its way. We want all kids to have as much resilience as they can and many schools as they can to be able to manage their time through that and get ahead.
Yeah.
If they sink now, the danger is that, in 5 years' time, there's a generation of kids that have much poorer prospects because we didn't plan properly.
Absolutely. Anne Longfield,